shadows in the rock. The waves crashed against the jagged cliffs of Alcatraz Island, their endless rhythm mocking the inmates trapped within its granite walls. Inside the infamous prison, the air was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of salt water and despair. Frank Morris's fingers absently traced the edges of the harmonica in his pocket, his sharp eyes scanning the narrow corridor outside his cell. He had been here for 3 years, but his mind had never stopped working on one thing: a way out. Alcatraz was no ordinary prison. It was the inescapable fortress, a place for men the system wanted forgotten. Frank wasn't just another convict, though. He was clever, a thinker. He'd been locked up for a string of bank robberies, but what set him apart was his ability to see opportunities where others saw dead ends. And Alcatraz? To him, it was just another puzzle waiting to be solved. The first seed of the escape plan had been planted during an afternoon shift in the prison's workshop. Frank had been assigned to scrape rust off old tools, a monotonous job with little supervision. That was when he met John and Clarence Anglin, 2 brothers from Georgia with a knack for mischief and a shared hatred of authority. They spoke in hushed tones, their accents soft but laced with conviction. The 3 men formed a bond, united by the idea of freedom. Over the next few months, the plan began to take shape. It started with the realization that the air vents in their cells were old and corroded. The thin metal could be chipped away with makeshift tools: spoons smuggled from the mess hall, pieces of scrap metal from the workshop. Each night, under the cover of darkness, they worked in silence, their hearts pounding with the fear of discovery. Frank kept a sharp ear out for the guards, timing their patrols down to the second. The chipped-away vents led to a narrow utility corridor behind the cells. It was filthy, filled with dust and the faint hum of the prison's plumbing. But it was a hidden space, one that gave them room to maneuver and plan. From there, they could access other parts of the prison, moving unseen in the shadows. It was in this corridor that the escape plan truly came to life. The men's ingenuity was their greatest weapon. Using stolen raincoats and fabric, they began crafting makeshift life vests and a raft. The prison library's magazines had been a goldmine of information, providing diagrams and articles about flotation devices. Clarence worked on the raft with dogged determination, using glue stolen from the workshop to seal the seams. John became the group's lookout, his charm and easy smile deflecting suspicion from the guards. Frank, meanwhile, focused on the tools they would need. He fashioned a drill from a stolen motor, attaching it to a piece of metal that could punch through steel bars. It was crude but effective. The men worked in shifts, hiding their progress behind fake vents they had carefully crafted from painted cardboard. By day they played the part of model prisoners. By night they chipped away at their confinement. The night of the escape was cold and moonless, the perfect cover. Frank felt the weight of the plan pressing down on him as he wriggled through the narrow vent into the utility corridor. Behind him, John and Clarence followed, their movements slow and deliberate. They had rehearsed this moment countless times, but the stakes now felt impossibly high. Navigating the utility corridor, they reached the prison's roof. The climb was treacherous, the wind cutting through their thin uniforms as they scaled pipes and beams. At one point, Clarence nearly slipped, his breath hitching as Frank grabbed his arm and steadied him. From the roof, they could see the lights of San Francisco shimmering across the bay, tantalizingly close yet impossibly far. The men descended to the outer wall, using a length of stolen electrical cord as a makeshift rope. Once on the ground, they sprinted to the shoreline, their footsteps muffled by the sand. Their raft awaited them, hidden beneath a pile of rocks. It was crude, patched together with glue and hope, but it was their only chance. The water was icy, numbing their limbs as they paddled furiously away from the island. The currents were strong, pulling them in unpredictable directions. At one point, a searchlight from the prison's watchtower swept across the bay, forcing them to freeze, their hearts hammering in their chests. When the light moved on, they paddled harder, driven by sheer willpower. The journey was grueling, the cold seeping into their bones. Waves crashed over the raft, threatening to tear it apart. Frank's hands were raw from gripping the makeshift paddle, his mind racing with a mix of determination and dread. Had they been spotted? Would the raft hold? Was freedom even possible? As dawn broke, the raft neared the shoreline of Angel Island. Exhausted and shivering, the men dragged themselves onto the beach, their breaths ragged but filled with relief. For the first time in years, they were free. What happened next would remain a mystery. The authorities would later find the remains of the raft and some personal items on the island, but Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were never seen again. Some believed they had drowned, their bodies claimed by the unforgiving currents of the bay. Others whispered that they had made it to safety, vanishing into the shadows to live out their lives far from Alcatraz's reach. In the end, their escape became legend, a tale of ingenuity and determination that proved even the inescapable could be conquered. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the world, 3 men might have shared a toast to the night they defied the rock. The next story will have you questioning everything. Let's get into it. In case you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot and helps us continue bringing you more spine-chilling content. Break through the iron veil. The air in Ridgewater Penitentiary carried a metallic taste, a biting blend of sweat, rust, and despair. Will Hale's fingers tightened around the cold steel bars of his cell, his gaze distant as the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. He watched as guards paced back and forth, their boots clapping against the stone floors in a rhythmic, oppressive beat. It was a tune he had come to hate, a constant reminder of how deep he was buried beneath layers of concrete and razor wire. For years. 4 long years since he had been convicted for a crime he didn't commit. The evidence had been flimsy, but the jury's verdict had been swift. Armed robbery. 15 years without parole. Will's protests of innocence had been drowned out by the gavel's final echo. Since then, he'd felt the noose of Ridgewater tightening around his neck, each day drawing the knot closer. But Will wasn't one to accept a slow death. Not here. Not like this. Escape wasn't just a desire, it was a necessity. It started small. Observations. Details. Will's mind had become a repository for every crack, every corner, every blind spot in the prison's unforgiving architecture. He learned the guards' patterns, which ones dragged their feet, which ones spoke to each other too long, and which ones were ruthless enough to shoot first and question later. There was Barker with his twitchy trigger finger, always lingering too long by the watchtower stairs. Ramirez, who smuggled contraband for the right price. And Henders, whose drinking problem was as much a secret as the sun rising every morning. Will knew the risks. He'd seen what happened to those who tried and failed. Jimmy Lowe. Transferred to solitary after they caught him with a makeshift grappling hook in the laundry room. Kyle Smiling Diaz. Shot dead in the yard when he bolted for the gates during exercise hour. The memory of Kyle's blood pooling on the cracked asphalt still haunted the other inmates, a ghostly reminder that freedom was a fool's errand. But Will wasn't like the others. He didn't rely on brute strength or blind courage. His mind was his weapon, honed by years of fixing machinery at his father's garage and solving puzzles with his younger sister, Mia. And it was Mia's memory that fueled him now. He'd promised her he'd protect her, and his incarceration had left her vulnerable to the same predators who had framed him. For her, he had to get out. The plan began to crystallize on a rainy Tuesday evening. The rain made the guards lax, their focus dull. Will's cellmate, a wiry man named Grayson, had been snoring softly in the top bunk when Will noticed it, a loose screw on the corner of the vent cover above their sink. He'd stared at it for hours, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and hope. It was small, insignificant. But in Ridgewater, even the smallest detail could crack open the door to possibility. Over the next week, Will tested the vent. Every night, after the guards finished their head count, he would stand on the sink, gripping the edge of the wall for balance as he gently worked the screw loose with a stolen spoon handle. The first time it moved, his breath caught. Progress. Grayson's involvement was inevitable. Despite his scrawny frame, the man had a knack for slipping through tight spaces. He'd been an escape artist of sorts before Ridgewater, breaking into bank vaults, squeezing past security lasers. His skills would be invaluable, but his loyalty was tenuous. Will knew he'd have to keep Grayson motivated, promising him a share of freedom while keeping the details of the plan tightly controlled. The escape would hinge on timing and misdirection. Ridgewater's perimeter was fortified with 2 layers of razor wire, motion sensors, and guard towers equipped with floodlights and rifles. But Will had noticed something peculiar during yard time. The south tower's light flickered every time it rotated past the utility building. A power issue, perhaps. Whatever it was, it meant there was a blind spot, one he intended to exploit. Will's strategy was meticulous. Grayson would create a distraction during yard time, a staged fight that would draw the guards' attention and force a temporary lockdown. During the chaos, Will would slip into the utility building, using a stolen maintenance key he'd been crafting out of scraps of metal he'd scavenged from the workshop. From there, he could access the underground tunnels that ran beneath the prison, an old system of drainage pipes that hadn't been used in decades. The tunnels would be the most dangerous part. They were dark, flooded in places, and crawling with rats. But if he could navigate them, they would lead him past the outer wall and into the forest beyond Ridgewater's borders. The night of the escape arrived faster than Will expected. His heart pounded as he lay in his bunk, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling. Outside, the rain hammered against the windows, a relentless percussion that masked the sound of his cell door creaking open. Grayson's wiry figure slipped past him, nodding once. It was time. The first part of the plan unfolded smoothly. Grayson's fight with another inmate, a burly man named Vance, erupted in the yard with convincing ferocity. Guards swarmed to break it up, shouting and brandishing batons. Will used the commotion to slip unnoticed into the utility building, his stolen key fitting perfectly into the rusted lock. He slipped inside, closing the door softly behind him. The air in the utility building was stifling, thick with the smell of oil and mildew. Will moved quickly, his steps silent as he navigated the maze of pipes and machinery. He found the hatch to the tunnels exactly where he'd expected it to be, hidden beneath a pile of discarded crates. For a moment, he hesitated, his fingers hovering over the latch. This was the point of no return. He opened it. The tunnels were worse than he'd imagined. The air was damp and heavy, the walls slick with moss and grime. Water pooled around his ankles, and the distant sound of rushing currents echoed like ghostly whispers. Will's flashlight, a contraband item he'd paid Ramirez for, cast a feeble beam that barely penetrated the darkness. Navigating the labyrinth was a test of endurance and resolve. Twice he nearly lost his footing, slipping on the wet stone. At one point he stumbled into a nest of rats, their high-pitched squeals sending a shiver down his spine. But the thought of Mia kept him moving forward, his breaths ragged but determined. Halfway through he heard it, voices. Muffled but distinct. His blood ran cold. The guards had discovered his absence. The hunt was on. The climax of the escape would come with a twist. Let me know if you'd like me to continue this scene with heightened tension and suspense, building toward the resolution of Will's desperate bid for freedom. The next story will have you questioning everything. Let's get into it. Shadows of Ironclad. The clanging of iron doors echoed down the long, sterile corridor, reverberating off the cold concrete walls of Ironclad Federal Penitentiary. This wasn't just any prison. This was where the most dangerous, most cunning criminals in America were sent to rot. To the warden, the place was escape-proof. To the guards, it was a fortress. To the inmates, it was hell. But to Jack Ghost Callahan, it was just a puzzle waiting to be solved. Jack sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the peeling paint on the wall across from him. His sharp blue eyes scanned the details of the room for the 1000th time, cataloging every crack, every imperfection. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above, mingling with the distant murmurs of guards on their rounds. He barely noticed anymore. Every sound, every shadow, was a thread in the tapestry of his plan. He'd been in Ironclad for 6 years, convicted of a series of high-profile heists that had embarrassed law enforcement agencies across 3 states. His nickname, Ghost, came from his uncanny ability to disappear before anyone even knew a crime had been committed. But this time they'd caught him. A small mistake. A fingerprint on a vault handle. And now, here he was, buried alive in a fortress where escape was a word whispered only in the darkest corners. But Jack wasn't the kind to give up. He'd been studying the prison since the day he arrived. Every routine, every weakness, every blind spot. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the patience to find it. And Jack had plenty of patience. The first step of his plan began with subtle observations. Ironclad was divided into 4 blocks, each with its own distinct layout and security measures. Jack was housed in Block C, that high-risk unit, reserved for those deemed too dangerous or too clever to mingle with the general population. The cells were small, but the air vents above each one provided a direct link to the maintenance tunnels below. The vents were covered by thick, rusted grates bolted into the walls. But Jack had noticed something the guards hadn't. The bolts on his grate were worn down, corroded by years of neglect. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jack spent months working on the bolts, using a piece of metal he'd scavenged from the workshop. It wasn't easy. The nights were long, the work painstakingly slow. Every scrape of metal on metal had to be timed perfectly with the distant sounds of guards' footsteps or the muffled roar of the prison's industrial laundry machines. One mistake, one noise out of place, and it would all be over. His cellmate, Diego, a wiry man with a talent for smuggling, had caught on quickly. "You're crazy, you know that?" Diego had whispered one night, watching Jack work on the grate. "Crazy's better than dead," Jack had replied without looking up. Diego had laughed quietly, shaking his head. But Jack knew Diego would come around. He needed someone on the outside, someone to cover for him when the time came. And Diego? Diego owed him a favor. The next phase involved acquiring tools. Diego's network of connections proved invaluable. A guard with a gambling problem, an inmate desperate for protection. Everyone had a price. Over the course of several weeks, Jack and Diego amassed a small arsenal of contraband. A stolen screwdriver, a length of sturdy wire, a makeshift lockpick. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The real challenge came when Jack realized the maintenance tunnels weren't the only obstacle. The prison's perimeter was surrounded by 2 layers of electrified fences, monitored by cameras and patrolled by armed guards. The only way out was through the loading bay, where deliveries came in twice a week. It was a weak point, but even then it was heavily guarded. That was when Jack's plan took an unexpected turn. He learned about the prison's waste disposal system, a series of underground pipes that led from the industrial laundry to a treatment facility outside the prison walls. The pipes were narrow, filthy, and guarded by heavy steel grates. But they were unmonitored, and to Jack that made them perfect. The night of the escape came on a stormy Friday, the rain lashing against the windows and drowning out the usual prison noise. Jack lay on his cot, his heart pounding as he waited for the signal. At exactly 2 a.m., Diego triggered the distraction, a staged fight in the common area. The guards rushed to intervene, their shouts echoing down the hallways. Jack seized the moment. He slipped through the vent, his body contorting to fit the narrow space. The air was stifling, the metal walls scraping against his skin as he crawled through the dark tunnel. He reached the maintenance corridor, dropping down into the shadows. The tools Diego had stashed for him were there, hidden behind a stack of cleaning supplies. Jack grabbed them and moved quickly, his footsteps silent on the damp concrete floor. Reaching the waste disposal pipes was the easy part. The hard part was breaking through the steel grate that covered the entrance. Jack worked furiously, the stolen screwdriver biting into the rusted bolts. Every second felt like an eternity, the fear of discovery gnawing at the edges of his mind. Finally, with a sharp crack, the last bolt gave way. Jack slipped into the pipe, the foul smell nearly overwhelming him. The journey through the pipes was a nightmare. The water was ice cold, rising to his chest in places. The narrow walls pressed in on him, the darkness absolute. Jack's breath came in shallow gasps, his hands gripping the slick, slimy walls for balance. He pushed forward, driven by sheer willpower and the thought of freedom. The final challenge came as Jack neared the treatment facility. He'd known there would be a final grate, but he hadn't anticipated how thick it would be. His tools were barely enough to make a dent, and his muscles screamed with exhaustion. Just when he thought it was hopeless, he heard a distant sound, the rumble of machinery. Seizing the opportunity, Jack timed his efforts with the noise, each blow of his makeshift tool hidden by the clatter of the facility's equipment. Finally, with one last desperate push, the grate gave way. Jack climbed out into the cool night air, the stars shining above him like a promise. Freedom. But it wasn't over yet. The facility's perimeter was still guarded, and Jack's escape wasn't complete until he reached the forest beyond. Crawling through the shadows, he avoided the guards' flashlights, his heart pounding with every step. When he finally reached the treeline, he allowed himself a single moment to breathe. Jack Callahan disappeared that night, his name added to the list of infamous escapes. Some said he fled to Mexico, others claimed he'd vanished into the wilderness. But wherever he went, one thing was certain. The legend of the man who escaped ironclad would live on, a testament to the power of determination and ingenuity in the face of impossible odds. Let's move on to the second story, and trust me, this one will keep you up at night. The break from Blackthorn. The rain drummed relentlessly against the stone walls of Blackthorn Prison, a sprawling Victorian fortress in the heart of the English countryside. Its looming towers pierced the stormy sky, casting long shadows over the razor-wire fences that encased it like a crown of thorns. Blackthorn was a name whispered with dread among inmates across the UK. It was inescapable, they said. A place where hope came to die. But for Daniel "Danny" Greaves, hope was the only thing keeping him alive. Danny sat on the edge of his bunk in cell 247, staring at the cracks in the wall. The air in Blackthorn was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of mildew and despair. He'd been here for 5 years, convicted of a high-stakes jewel heist that had made headlines. They'd never found the diamonds, though. That was Danny's ace. The authorities believed he'd stashed them somewhere, but only Danny knew the truth. And he wasn't going to rot here another day without a fight. Escape wasn't just a fantasy for Danny. It was a plan, one he'd been crafting since the moment they slammed the iron door shut behind him. The first step was patience. Danny's blue eyes scanned every corner of the prison during his daily routines, cataloging guard rotations, security blind spots, and the weaknesses in Blackthorn's ancient infrastructure. The place was a fortress, sure, but it wasn't impenetrable. Nothing was. The first glimmer of opportunity came during his job in the prison's laundry room. It was a sprawling, steaming hellhole of clattering machines and sweaty inmates, but it was also a hub for contraband. Danny made friends quickly, earning favors and building a network. One of those friends was Liam "Slim" Carter, a wiry man with a knack for picking locks and a past littered with petty crimes. Slim was the perfect partner, skilled, desperate, and most importantly loyal. "You're mental, you know that?" Slim muttered one evening as they sat in the corner of the yard, hunched over a chessboard fashioned from cardboard and bottle caps. "No one's ever gotten out of Blackthorn." "They haven't tried hard enough," Danny replied, moving his makeshift knight across the board. "Besides, I'm not planning to stay here until I'm old and gray. Are you?" Slim's silence was all the answer Danny needed. The plan began to take shape over months of careful preparation. The key was Blackthorn's subterranean tunnels, remnants of the old sewer system that ran beneath the prison. They'd been abandoned decades ago, replaced by modern plumbing, but Danny had overheard a guard mention them during a conversation in the mess hall. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. Using Slim's network of contacts, they acquired a crude map of the tunnels, sketched from memory by an inmate who had worked on the prison's maintenance crew. It showed a network of twisting passages leading to an old drainage pipe that opened into the nearby river Wyvern. The map wasn't detailed, but it was enough. The next step was gathering tools. Slim used his skills to steal small items from the workshop. A screwdriver here, a length of wire there. Danny bribed a guard with the promise of a cut from the jewel heist to look the other way when packages of contraband arrived. Over time, they amassed a collection of tools hidden in a hollowed-out mattress. A shiv, a metal file, a flashlight cobbled together from stolen batteries, and a rope fashioned from laundry room sheets. The night of the escape was cold and moonless, the perfect cover. Danny and Slim moved quickly, their breaths visible in the freezing air as they navigated the shadows of the cell block. They had spent weeks loosening the screws on the vent in Danny's cell, and now it came away with a soft groan. The vent opened into a narrow maintenance shaft that led to the old tunnels. The climb down was treacherous. The shaft was slick with condensation, and every movement sent echoes bouncing off the walls. Danny went first, gripping the rope tightly as he descended into the darkness. Slim followed, his wiry frame slipping through the narrow space with ease. At the bottom, the air was thick and foul, the scent of stagnant water and rot almost overwhelming. They followed the map through the tunnels, their flashlight casting eerie shadows on the damp walls. The ground was uneven, and pools of water made every step precarious. Rats scurried in the darkness, their squeaks adding to the tension. Danny's heart pounded with every step, the weight of the plan pressing down on him. One mistake, one wrong turn, and it would all be over. Halfway through, they hit their first obstacle, a rusted gate blocking their path. The map hadn't mentioned it, and for a moment, panic flared in Danny's chest. Slim pulled out the file and set to work, his hands moving with practiced precision. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the tunnel, and Danny held his breath, straining to hear any sign of pursuit. After what felt like an eternity, the gate gave way with a groan. They pressed on, the sound of rushing water growing louder. The final stretch of the tunnel sloped downward, leading to the drainage pipe. But as they rounded the last corner, Danny's stomach dropped. The pipe was sealed with a heavy steel grate, newer and more secure than anything they'd encountered so far. "What now?" Slim whispered, his voice tinged with desperation. Danny examined the grate, his mind racing. The screws were reinforced, impossible to loosen with their tools. But then he saw it. A small gap at the bottom, just big enough to wedge the screwdriver in. It would take force, a lot of it. "Help me," Danny said, motioning for Slim to join him. Together they pushed and pried at the grate, their muscles straining. The metal groaned, but it held fast. "Come on," Danny growled, pouring every ounce of strength into one final push. With a deafening crack, the grate broke free, falling into the water below. The icy current hit them like a punch to the gut as they slipped into the river. The water roared around them, pulling them downstream. Danny fought to keep his head above the surface, the taste of mud and salt in his mouth. Slim was just ahead, his arms flailing as he tried to steer toward the far bank. When they finally dragged themselves onto the shore, they collapsed in the mud, gasping for air. The lights of Blackthorn glimmered in the distance, but they were free. For the first time in 5 years, Danny felt the weight of the prison lift from his shoulders. He looked at Slim, who was grinning despite the mud on his face. "Told you it wasn't impossible," Danny said, his voice hoarse but triumphant. "Yeah," Slim replied, chuckling. "But let's never do that again." As they disappeared into the night, the rain washed away their tracks, leaving only the legend of the men who broke free from Blackthorn. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more thrilling stories. And hit the bell icon to never miss an update.